How's it going, everyone? It's Masenko here, and this was a video that I think some of you in the VDL were interested in me creating, so that there's some discussion about it. This is about players' playstyles. Playstyles are a very interesting topic to me. I tend to approach games, and especially strategy games, from a more like theoretical framework a lot of times, and try to like either learn about or apply my own sort of principles that I think are helpful in guiding my sort of decision making. And I think playstyles, especially when trying to figure out my own play style, what are my preferences, is incredibly helpful to sort of like have that framework when analyzing. So let's just dive right into it. What I mean by play style is like, how does someone's preferences, how do they like show up in the game? How do they make use of the game mechanics to sort of like represent themselves? So when we talk about playstyle, sort of the underlying discussion is really about game mechanics, right? It is a question of what game mechanics is this person tending towards? What sort of win condition do they feel comfortable with or enjoy doing? And I think when you take all these mechanics, they each provide you with some form of options. They give you with different ways to play the game across so many different spectrums. And being able to, combine those game mechanics to create some sort of strategy, that is where I think playstyles tend to emerge. Now, as like a literal sense, there are many different spectrums of within the game in terms of the base mechanics, like speed, stats, how the turns resolve, what your optionality is in terms of Pokemon, etc. But I also do think there are some other spectrums that are really important here, which tend towards sort of like fundamental spectrums of player preference. And I think the three main ones that I kind of thought of off the top of my head, I'm sure you can think of more, are the proactive versus reactive spectrum, the risk and reward spectrum, and the sort of meta spectrum. What I mean by proactive versus reactive is when this player starts to think about a matchup or how they approach the game, do they focus more on what they're doing, or are they focusing more on what their opponent is doing in terms of how they're developing their strategy? Are they trying to dictate the pace of the game, or are they bringing tools for things they're anticipating their opponent to bring that they can effectively deal with them? So obviously, no one player is 100% proactive or 100% reactive. Again, it is a spectrum, right? You can tend towards more proactive play, but still have a sort of reactive mindset in some situations. And you could also be a more reactive player, but recognize opportunities to be proactive. To go over the risk versus reward one, I think this is a very interesting one that will sort of like shape your decision making in game a lot of times, but also this goes down to prep and play style in a lot of ways too. Are you somebody who is willing to go for the 80% accurate moves to get that extra damage in? Or are you going to play it safe and try to, maybe pick a less powerful move in theory for more consistency? And then finally, the meta versus unconventional spectrum, I think has similar has like a sort of, it's like kind of the brother of the risk and reward a little bit. Meta picks tend to be super consistent, and unconventional picks tend to be more niche, just as a just general rule. So I mean, obviously the draft the draft meta is very different, and I hesitate to even say there is really a meta. Though, obviously some Pokemon do tend to perform better across seasons than others, like Tapu Fini and Celesteela and Metagross and stuff like that, from what I've seen. But again, like, that does not mean they've created a meta. People don't really always. I mean, if you're drafting a team, you might want to think about those Pokemon, and think about how you might approach them. But that doesn't mean people always are like, yeah, I need to have an answer to this specific Pokemon, because it's not even guaranteed you'll even fight that Pokemon. So the meta in draft is a little weird, but this is another sort of topic of like, do you go for the more obvious strategies too? That's another way of thinking about it, is like, if you see a Colossal Dragapult in a max format, it's a pretty obvious combo, right? But do you as a player, do you feel inclined to bring that? Or are you somebody who goes, this is going to be super obvious that I'm bringing this, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to anticipate what they're bringing to stop it and try to exploit that and like come up with something creative and different. I think a lot of draft players tend towards more unconventional in play, but I have seen a lot of draft players who do kind of go more standard in terms of like, they're not really surprising me with their tech or their sets. And that's not necessarily a bad thing either. I think, consistency is the name of the game sometimes. So let's move on a little bit more. And talk about sort of like, I'm going to start talking a little bit more about like specific play styles. And so these are some more sort of like mechanics of the game that I think, like I said, a play style really develops around how you approach, winning the game or playing the game. One point here is about like, in order to win any game, you need to accumulate some kind of advantages, and I think the 5 here that I've listed are sort of the base ones that I can really think about for Pokemon in particular. But I'm sure there are like so many more that are worth mentioning here. The first one is raw stats. Raw stats can be really, really helpful in a lot of ways. Speed control can be really, really helpful in a lot of ways. If you hit first, that's one of the main game mechanics is if you have speed control, you have the ability to deny your opponent even the ability to make their move. Another mechanic in Pokemon that I think is very unique to it actually is this idea of the momentum. Sort of like this momentum pendulum, as opposed to, a snowball. The Pokemon I show there is Urshifu, because I think Urshifu is a really interesting, like sort of like the case study when it comes to talking about momentum, in my opinion, because, Urshifu is never really the mon you want to switch in manually. You always want to either have like a really good reason to lead it, or you want to have a really good reason to have it in the back so that when something dies, you can use that free switch as a huge momentum swing. Now Urshifu's in, it has this insane ability to go past protects, and you can really leverage that momentum and force your opponent into a really sticky situation if you have, that speed control and that momentum is actually doing something for you, which a lot of times it certainly will. Just being able to get that extra damage down on something, make them hesitant to switch, but also, they can't protect. Who is he going to attack? It's so much power in terms of that momentum that something like Urshifu brings. And I think that's pretty unique to Pokemon, because it's sort of, like I said, the image that comes to mind is sort of like a pendulum rather than sort of like a snowball. Being able to leverage that and understand that mechanic is pivotal when it comes to talking about gaining advantages and having a play style, and how that factors into having a play style, for sure. Positioning is also super important in Pokemon. Being able to position your Pokemon correctly and catch your opponent out of position when it comes to what is out on their side of the field, forcing them to make a suboptimal switch or, waste their time. All of that is super important. And of course, there's just like game sense, right? If you have enough knowledge to have a sense of what your opponent is going to do in any given turn, using that to sort of identify the safe plays, the risky plays, the game-winning plays, etc., all of that will give you that incremental advantage. If you have a better game sense than your opponent, that usually is pretty good for you. You can really turn a losing situation into a winning situation. You can turn less powerful mons into powerhouses that take out more meta picks. And that second bullet point there talks about this idea of natural advantages versus earned advantages. These can be sort of like described as like, this is a very sort of theoretical concept, right? So I think the best example here is like raw stats is a very natural advantage. If you have a Cresselia on the field, you already have a natural advantage in the fact that it has so many raw stats. And then how you leverage that natural advantage is going to factor into the type of play style that you have. And then earned advantages, going back to this idea of game sense or positioning. If you can outwit your opponent or outposition your opponent to get that slight extra damage, you've now earned an advantage, and how you use that earned advantage is going to translate as well. So we're talking about all of that when we're talking about play styles. So keep all of those in mind as we go through the following sort of play styles that I tend to think are pretty interesting. So here's sort of an overview of like how I tend to categorize different sort of like far ends of the spectrum of a play style. Now, again, this is just a framework, right? It is a spectrum. Not everyone is going to be 100% proactive or 100% reactive. And you'll generally, every single team is going to have a broad mix of both of these, or all three of these, I suppose, if you include the mixed category there. But so these are the kind of the two big categories are the proactive and the reactive category. I think that generally applies to most players, and you can kind of categorize them in those two ways, in terms of like what you see them preferring more. Of course, yeah. So let's just kind of dive into it, and also I will be discussing some of the teams in the VDL here. If you're not mentioned, please don't read too much into that. I just sort of like cherry picked teams that I thought were pretty representative of these different play styles. So yeah. Anyway, let's move on. Let's talk about proactive, and I call this sort of aggro, right? Aggressive, being the person who wants to dictate the flow of the game and sort of like set the tone, right? You're thinking more about like, okay, can I OHKO something? How can I leverage damage and speed control to basically like snowball a game? So here's, again, not universal, but one starting point that a burst player will tend to look at, and this is one form of category, one category of proactiveness slash aggro. I call this burst, which is essentially I'm going to have really, really high offensive stats, and I might even make sacrifices elsewhere in order to get those stats higher. One Pokemon who very clearly represents this is Galarian Darmanitan, who is shown right there. I mean, his ability, Guerrilla Tactics, literally is just a built-in choice band. So, yeah, I mean, you're basically sacrificing 3 move slots for extra damage, on top of which you can equip a choice band on it, which is kind of insane. And usually that's enough to KO something, right? And then the aggro player, the burst player, will leverage that, those high offensive stats. They're going to get kills, and with that, they're going to make it really hard for the opponent to reposition, to get their footing, because every single turn they're going to be faced with the inevitability that one of their Pokemon might die if they make the wrong step. And a really good aggro player is going to basically play around their opponent's sort of anxiety with regard to the Pokemon in front of them. Dracovish is another really good example of this. Dracovish obviously has Vicious Rend, which is one of the strongest, just sort of like burst moves in the game, along with Strongjaw. One thing to note about burst teams is that they do need some form of infrastructure. Like, if you want to make Darmanitan work, if you want to make Dracovish work, or anything else, like another Mon that comes to mind who has a lot of burst potential is Kartana. All these Mons are sacrificing something important. So Dracovish, obviously, in order to make Vicious Rend work, you need to be faster than your opponent. And so when you draft a Dracovish, you're going to have to build some sort of infrastructure to either give it Tailwind or allow it to work under Trick Room, which is pretty difficult, or just like basically get some speed control somehow in order to make it faster than your opponent, in order to make it work. And so a lot of these Mons, you can't just like pile them on in your team. You're basically gonna build around these big threats on your team, and use the momentum of, you might get 2 kills with the Darmanitan, and then it goes down. Who cares? You send out your next big threat, and you've essentially made up for all of that momentum. Just to recap, this is a type of playstyle that really takes advantage of being very threatening on the board right away. The next one, let's talk about a pretty good burst team that is within the VDL right now. Obviously, Gumi of the Rolled Gold Pretzels has a really good burst playstyle. I wouldn't say his team is 100%, burst all day, every day. But before I dive into that, I do want to say I do know, even though this season it wasn't, the sort of like chosen play style, but I know Lucian is an incredibly aggressive player, and I tend to think that he kind of falls into this category as well. But so let's talk about this team real quick, and why it sort of has this burst, and like some of the ways that Gumi used this team. The one Mon I will say is so good for this team is obviously this Tornadus. Again, like I said, you need to build the infrastructure for an aggro team with burst damage to work. And the fact that, you have this insane prankster Mon who might have Defiant instead, who has also like a lot of burst potential itself. It's just kind of insane at enabling all these burst mons. Sharpedo has really good burst with very high base attack, has close combat, and again, you're like sacrificing all your bulk in order to make that work. Garchomp, I'd say his main weakness is this like 4 times ice weakness that you have to be aware of. And, you know, against this team, you're very incentivized to bring ice coverage, especially because there's also Tornadus. But like, even with that, you know, Garchomp can just one-shot stuff. You have a strong build with it, and you have the speed control for it. It just goes ham. Some other sort of characteristics that I'll note. Heracross is a mon with an ability called Moxie, and I think I can't remember its other abilities. Does it have? It has guts, right? Yeah. So like that's another thing is, you know, having guts gives you that boost. Like all of these mons, well, maybe not all of them, but you know, especially Heracross has these really offensive abilities as well that allow you to snowball more. I mean, like Moxie is the ultimate snowball ability, right? It just lets you take one kill, and it just makes it easier for you to get another kill the next turn if you haven't gotten killed. Magmortar and Aggron were mons that I wanted to mention here. I don't think they are like the de facto burst mons that you think about, but how Gumi used them was very bursty. Against me, he really leveraged Magmortar with like Solar Beam to deal with the Gastrodon, used it with Scorching Sands to deal with my weak, ground weak mons, and like a lot of the reason I lost that playoff match was because of this like Magmortar just like threatening this burst damage, right? It was just there, it was on the field, and I had to make the correct read as to who it was going to go for. It was just a menace, right? And if it looked like I was floundering in that game, I mean, I was. And that's sort of like one thing that burst players, a good burst player does, as Gumi is they're going to make their opponents, even if they're really good opponents, look like they're floundering because they just can never find their footing against these mons. In his final match, he brought Aggron against Matrix with this like really cool head smash set. Again, very indicative of the burst playstyle, right? You're just trying to take KOs quickly and efficiently. And honestly, Ditto is not really a burst style of Pokemon. It's like kind of a weird one that can fill a lot of different interesting roles, I think, depending on how you use it. But I mean, the main idea behind Ditto, how everyone uses it, it's including Gumi, and he used it in very creative ways as well. But you kind of slap a scarf onto it. You're gonna steal their highly offensive mon, but you're gonna be faster than them. And like Ditto can be kind of an annoying burst mon as well, especially if you are up against somebody who is trying to set up on you and you just take that setup from them. It can be very devastating and create that pressure that burst teams are notorious for. The next one I talk about here is Tempo. This is sort of a different style of aggro. I kind of like to sometimes call it sort of like an assassin, sort of like play style. And really what its goal is to take incremental advantages throughout the course of the game, and just sort of like win in that way, picking up KOs in key moments. So like the starting point that generally I find is like, what is my most flexible lead? What can I do to just kind of have a safe avenue to deal damage to my opponent? Something that I tend to find Tempo type players doing, or like tempo mons that are most effective, are those who are able to pivot and reposition. Mianxiao is an excellent example of this. You have a mon who has fake out, so you are incentivized to basically try to switch it out at some point to reset that potentially. You can bring it with Regenerator. I don't think it's a particularly good ability, but sort of does also incentivize that a little bit. You can bring it with U-turn to deal some really, nice chip damage to something and get a free switch out into a mon that can potentially tank whatever is coming its way. And then you also have that high burst damage with like close combat or high jump kick. But, unlike before, although, you're against a Mianxiao, you're not always worrying too much about that. You're able to sort of think about ways to kind of counterplay it, in my opinion. Rather than worrying about it just one-shotting everything, because it usually gets like one thing off and then you can pretty much usually kill it, as opposed to a Mag Mortar, which is going to be a little bit harder to kill potentially, or like a Garchomp. But basically what I'm trying to say is Mianxiao is very good at, in those moments where you've broken the sash or you've chipped it enough, Mianxiao can take that kill and translate that into momentum. So the emphasis here is on positioning and trading. How can I just chip my opponent well enough that I'm in an advantage where I can just like pick up the KOs, sort of like the assassin, right? Like you kind of wait for that opportune moment to strike and go for the throat. And this type of playstyle definitely requires a lot of patience and sort of an understanding of how much damage you're doing at any given moment, whether you can pick up those KOs, right? Like Incineroar is a great example of a tempo mon as well. Not only does it give you tempo by having like Intimidate and Fake Out and whatnot, just really dynamic abilities that just sort of like create natural advantages, sort of like those incremental advantages that I was talking about, but also like it gets like Flare Blitz and good coverage in that sense, and you're not always going to KO everything with a Flare Blitz from an Incineroar, right? But those moments when you can and do are so impactful. That's sort of like the MO of that tempo play style. Someone who I think has a particularly good tempo team is actually Goomer, not Goomy, of the Bolton Bashers. I don't know if I would 100% say he always goes for this tempo play style, but I do think, just in my opinion, like from what I've seen, he looks like a very strong tempo player if that is his preferred play style. One thing I've noticed a lot is this sort of like Galarian Zapdos lead, right? I see it a lot when it comes to Goomer. Galarian Zapdos is that sort of safety that I was talking about before. It is a mon with great pivot potential with U-turn. It has good ability to sort of like pick up random KOs or chunk things. It's easy to protect with. You're not really worried about Intimidates because of Defiant, so you have like a very consistent source of damage there. And that's basically like everything you need for a good tempo mon. And Goomer uses it very well in that way, using it to pivot, using it to pick up KOs, switching it out at opportune moments. And I think the other mons on this list as well sort of fit into that category as well in different ways. Swampert is a really good switch-in for the Zapdos, right? You worried about obviously like an electric move. It's gonna, Swampert's gonna eat that. Basically this Swampert is a really good pivot mon. It's bulky enough that it can take some hits, but obviously it also has this like 4 times weakness that you see 3 of these mons have 4 times weaknesses here. The tempo playstyle doesn't care too much about this. It is really using positioning and so much that even if the opponent has the right move to deal with Amon, it's able to have like sort of a backup plan for that, and sort of like control the pace of the game that way. You'll notice like Swampert has like Flip Turn, another great pivoting ability. Persian also has U-Turn, great pivot. Fake Out on the Persian. Yeah, so much stuff going on there. And then the Gyarados and the Ninetales, the reason I think these are pretty decent pivot mons as well is because of their dynamic abilities, right? Having Intimidate is so useful, and it's an ability that, like when we were talking about it with Incineroar, it is great for pivot mons. It's great for mons that you want to keep switching in and out. With Gyarados, you're going to be looking to switch it in and out because, there's a lot that potentially threatens it. But having those Intimidates every single time it comes out, you're still gaining those incremental advantages throughout the game. Same with the Ninetales. Ninetales is incredibly fast mon. It sets Hail, which is automatic sort of tempo, especially when paired with the Arctozolt that he has on his team as well. You are basically, from switching in a Ninetales, if your Arctozolt was already on the field, you're basically just giving it a speed boost from that switch. Not to mention Hail, that chip damage is also great tempo, right? It's giving you incremental advantages. And switching it in and out, preserving that Hail, preserving the weather to counter other weather, all of that is very dynamic stuff. And, setting Aurora Veil can give you a lot of incremental advantage as well, even though it is a more defensive style. But, Ninetales can go offensive as well. Blizzard spam is definitely always an option. It's a very good tempo mon. And I think Goomer has played this mon, or this team, incredibly well in terms of tempo. So those are sort of the main categories of aggressive, sort of proactive play that I've noticed. Moving on to control, or sort of more reactive play style. Just to refresh, obviously this is about ways in which you are thinking about more so your opponent's sort of potential than your own sort of like strategy that you're constructing yourself. You're bringing more so tools or counter strategy, more based on your matchup, and translating the sort of like tools you brought into advantages, because you may have successfully anticipated, So, what is this first category of control? I like to sort of think of it as sort of like stall or sustain. Your first sort of question when you're thinking about this type of sort of control style is like, what mons can't my opponent kill? It's sort of like the exact opposite of the burst aggro. What mons can't my opponent burst? And how can I use that to my advantage? If he's bringing a, choice banded, max attack, adamant, whatever, can my Umbreon tank that? And if yes, you're going to be able to basically use that turn almost guaranteed to essentially make some space for yourself in order to gain that advantage. Let your partner breathe. Umbreon and Porygon 2 are definitely very scary sustain mons that I think are pretty indicative of the style. When it comes to Umbreon, and so like if we're talking about the category generally speaking, there are kind of two ways to sort of like make this strategy work. And it's generally through damage mitigation. And the two styles of damage mitigation are either, you know, reducing your opponent's damage, like directly, or healing up the damage you already took. Umbreon is an excellent example of this style of Mon because generally speaking, you're bringing both Snarl and Moonlight on this Pokemon, right? Snarl is there to reduce your opponent's damage. Moonlight is there to heal you up for the damage you already took. Something characteristic of this type of Mon is they're really looking towards the end games. They're looking for like their win condition to be, I have killed the one thing on your team that can actually deal with Umbreon, and now my Umbreon's just going to sit on the field, tank damage, heal everything up, reduce your damage to nothing, and then just slowly stall you out at the end of the game until either they chip you enough to win or they win on timer. Is very indicative of this type of team. Porygon 2 has the advantage of having sort of like the download ability. Sometimes you'll get a really nice special attack boost, which makes it super duper threatening. But what's so scary about this Mon is like, I mean, it gets recover first and foremost, so there's your damage mitigation. But like it has the ability to create its own speed control with Trick Room, really strong stab and tri attack that can be also very disruptive. It can get freezes, it can get paras, which is cutting your damage down sort of inherently by making it so you have less speed control and you have that chance to basically paralyze, right? Or it's sort of like akin to like a flinch, right? Or it can like burn you, which is in its own right damage control, cutting certain Mon's attack in half. So like it's got the whole package there. Yeah, so I think I've adequately explained sort of like the general idea behind it. I think y'all know who is going to be the person I highlight for this type of style. It's going to be Gert and the Old English Ice Cues. His team had a lot of options that weren't very stally. And I think this is pretty common of like stall teams. You are gonna, I mean, this is Pokemon. You're gonna have to have damage threats. You can't just have everything be infinite bulk. Really, you're gonna have to try to have options that can take out the one or two major threats that deal with your bulky endgame Mon, right? But I mean, just look at this lineup of bulky Mons, right? It's got, I mean, Cresselia, one of the highest base stat totals in the game, really leveraging its natural bulk to create those advantages. You can also run Moonlight on it. You can run Calm Mind to even boost it up further. And we'll talk about that kind of a play style in a little while when it comes to sort of like scaling. Decent scaling Mon has good immunities, like one good immunity in the form of ground immunity with Levitate, and as a psychic type, it doesn't have like too many common weaknesses, just the 3. So that's like it's super great Mon. Cradilly as well, again, has some immunities, is not really weak to too many different types, has a really good defensive typing in the form of, well, I guess grass isn't very good defensively, but like I think the rock grass combo is not terrible. Being able to mitigate that rock's ground weakness and the water weakness for sure, and grass being having its fire weakness mitigated and its flying weakness mitigated. It's like there's a lot of like a lot of damage that could have been strong against Cradilly that, since it has its dual typing, is a little bit less so. Of course, it has Recover, it has Leech Seed, it can just sit there and outbulk you so easily. And of course, it has Storm Drain, so you got to be careful when facing against a Cradilly not to be too liberal with your water moves. Toxapex, same deal. Recover has an excellent protect move that's signature to it that will poison you. Has Regenerator. Has so many defensive options that if you just don't have the way to break it, it'll kill you. Skarmory as well. Iron Defense, Roost. All of these mons have really good defensive boosting options in addition to healing, in addition to damage mitigation. And the rest of the team sort of around that is trying to complement that very nicely. I know he had like Excelgor, for instance, who gets Struggle Bug. Really nice way to lower special attack, kind of like Snarl. More any sort of damage mitigation is just going to do wonders for you. So there you go. This is a really, really indicative team. There's not a ton more to say about this type of strategy. It's pretty straightforward, and if built correctly, it can be incredibly oppressive, right? Like if you just don't have an answer to any one of the four of these mons, he's gonna try to take advantage of that. He can see like, oh, you don't have an answer for my Skarmory? Okay, I'm just gonna bring Skarmory then, and like, good luck, right? It can be very, very oppressive if you didn't just draft the right mon. Next one is disruption, and as opposed to damage mitigation, like before, this style of control really looks to just dig deep and sort of like laser in on the exact strategy that your opponent's going to bring, and try to just sort of like beat that outright. Really just disrupt them, make them have a bad time, sort of cripple them, right? So, starting point, how can I stop my opponent's game plan? You're going to create obstacles for them. You're going to have a sort of like you're going to have sort of like a proactive style of pressure that you're providing, but it's less of a positive advantage for you and more of a negative advantage for your opponent, which is why it is more reactive, right? Your opponent is losing tempo rather than you necessarily gaining tempo. These types of mons, you can kind of, this is less of a cohesive strategy that you build an entire team around doing. You definitely, I think, could potentially just have a very disruptive team that really just kind of shuts down every possible thing your opponent does. Maybe that can happen, but a lot of times these are just key mons that you have on your team that really provide that sort of disruption. Mons like Sableye, mons like Lopunny. Sableye is great, gets Quash, good speed control, gets Will-O-Wisp, good damage control, gets Taunt, good control against stuff that's trying to set up on you, gets Encore, again, really good against stuff that's trying to set up on you, has lots of good immunities, meaning that you can't just easily, you can't fake it out unless you have Kangaskhan, just stuff like that. It's just like really annoying and disruptive. Lopunny is sort of similar, fake out, obviously, and Sableye has fake out as well, obviously, so there's that, which is incredibly disruptive, a very disruptive move for stuff that's trying to build momentum on turn one. But Lopunny also gets Encore. It gets Switcheroo. I think Sableye does get Trick. But another thing that Lopunny gets, which is really interesting, is this Klutz ability, making it so that it can bring eject button and not have it procced on itself. It can bring entrainment, which is a really interesting ability where you can give someone Klutz. So it's like, I found for, at least for me, the reason I put Lopunny here is I think for me it was a very good disruption mon for my team, and sort of like indicative of how this sort of play style it goes about doing what it's doing. And that disruption can really create some space for you. Let's talk about some teams that I think, like, once again, I don't think any team, I had some trouble sort of like finding teams that really did this as a sort of central part of their team rather than sort of like their play styles. But I found that the Brisbane Blazekins and Sting Like a Rabombi were two teams that had a lot of really interesting disruption options. We already talked about Sableye. I'm going to talk about the Rabambis first here. We already talked about Sableye. Weavile also has really annoying disruption, and it's just really because of that super fast fake out. You generally can't get past it. It's that really annoying mon that you just have to like try to play around. Also gets taunt, gets like icy wind, stuff like that. Super annoying, disruptive. Mandiba's also quite disruptive in a lot of ways. It's immune to powder moves. It has like all sorts of annoying tech that it can bring. It has foul play. All of this like can be disruptive to your opponent's strategy. As you can see, like foul play is a move that uses your opponent's advantages against them. It anticipates that your opponent has this thing that you're really gonna just like shut down, right? Key tech. And Zoroark is also a super disruptive mon just by virtue of its ability. It's incredibly unique in that way too. Most disruption comes in the form of just like moves and abilities. I guess the ability does apply here, but like what I mean is, you know, Intimidate is a pretty good disruptive ability as well. It kind of shuts you down a little bit in certain ways. But Zoroark really disrupts your opponent's sort of mental state in a lot of ways. It goes directly to the mind games aspect of it, where your opponent sees a mon on your side of the field, and it's just they're not sure whether it's Zoroark or not, and it's going to affect how they play. And because of that, you can potentially take advantage of the fact that they're going to have to play around the Zoroark just existing at any point. Now, for the Brisbane Blazekins, I don't think they had a super disruptive playstyle, but I do want to point out some sort of like disruptive mons on their team. First of which being Clefable. Follow Me just as an ability is super disruptive. Like, I mean, literally, it's just redirecting what you want to be doing a lot of times. And unlike Rage Powder, you know, you can't get around it. So I think Clefable is an interesting mon in that sense. And then Unaware is also like a super... I mean, like both of its abilities, Magic Bounce and Unaware, have like super interesting options for being disruptive, right? You know, you just sort of like with Unaware, you can sort of waste your opponent's turns if they're trying to set up on you. And then with Magic Bounce, you know, you can redirect some status move into you sometimes and bounce it back to your opponent, and it's just going to be like you just killed their game plan, right? The Rotom can also be a pretty disruptive mon. I'm more thinking more like it's like Will-O-Wisp capabilities, the fact that it has Levitate, the fact that it just has like good options in that sense. Morgrem, again, super disruptive, gets, you know, Fake Out, gets screens, gets Fake Tears. I don't know if it gets Encore. I'm pretty sure it also... Does it get Taunt? There's a lot about Morgrem that I actually don't know its whole moveset. I always get confused with all the Prankster mons. And, you know, Blastoise has some interesting disruptive capabilities too. Gets Fake Out. And you know, you're not always sure exactly what it's going to do. So in a lot of ways, the disruption game comes in two flavors. Like hard disruption in the sense that like you can use a move very efficiently to shut down something your opponent's doing, but also just sort of like the mental game behind these mons. What is this mon going to do? Is this mon Zoroark? It can be very disruptive to your opponent's game plan just by existing. So that's how I kind of think about it. This category was definitely a little bit more vague than the others, and it was kind of hard to find good examples of what I meant by this. But, you know, as you can, I hope you at least got something from that. Then the final category that I just want to touch on is sort of a mixed style of setup/scaling. It is a style that makes use of control tools to create an end game or late game that you get to take the role of the aggro person. You get to become the the superior, the Ubermensch, right? Bulk and supportive options are being used in this sort of a play style to buy time. You are essentially buying time in order to set up some combo or just click, you know, like Iron Defense on your Registeel. I think Iron Defense Body Press is one of the best examples of this type of a strategy, just because it is simultaneously incredibly defensive because you get that defensive boost and make you harder to kill, but in doing so, you're literally scaling the damage that you're doing. So the longer you get to sit there on the field and bulk up and get all these stat boosts, the harder it is for your opponent to effectively react to it. So in some sense, you need to have like the infrastructure and the mentality of a control player in order to set everything up, set the stage for yourself, disrupt your opponent, make sure they can't to get in on you. But at the same time, you're being very proactive by sort of just half ignoring what your opponent does and just kind of like trying to bulk yourself up at any given good opportunity. Another mon really good for this is the Galarian Moltres. Nasty Plot with Berserk has very good natural scaling. Usually can't just one-shot a Galarian Moltres. Like, I don't know many Pokemon who can really just do that without a ton of investment to try to do that. But like, because of that, if you can, if you trigger Berserk, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot a little bit. It can be really difficult to beat. You can also run just like weakness policy on a lot of these types of mons as well. Self-procking with that's something you might be looking to do with this setup and the scaling options. So basically, this style needs enablers, it needs protection, but it also can rely on its own natural bulk in a lot of senses. And the real emphasis here is on like making sure you're doing it at the right time and also applying enough pressure in the sense of that proactive style in order to make room for yourself to get to that aggro late game where you're just one-shotting stuff with the mon you built up. I think myself and Saki have pretty good examples of this style. Moltres, obviously, we just talked about, gets Nasty Plot, gets Berserk, gets good weakness policy options in terms of like, ways to... It can easily be self-procced just due to its typing. You can do Ice Shard, stuff like that. And so... so basically, Moltres, super good for that. Raikou has very similar scaling potential. You start spamming Calm Mind. It's this like inner focus mon. It's really good at being set up, bulky enough to take a couple hits, but with enough infrastructure support, you can set screens with it. It can be super, super easy to help scale with. Just a super consistent mon. And then there's Bronzong, who gets Iron Defense Body Press, who gets Calm Mind, who has a lot of immunities, who is incredibly tanky, who applies a lot of pressure in some ways because it could be doing something else other than just simply bulking up. All of this is pretty indicative of good scaling. On my end, I have Turtonator, once again, Iron Defense Body Press, but also like Shell Smash, right? Good options in that sense to get the Turtonator rolling, but it does require a little bit of setup. Same with Snorlax. You can do Belly Drum, you can do Curse on a good Trick Room team. All of that super good. And then I think Octillery has, just like the Moody ability, really good scaling. The longer the game goes on, the more stat boosts you get, the more the more your opponent cries. You just get more value every turn by the longer it goes, the longer the game goes on. And that's pretty indicative of a good scaling mon. So yeah, so I mean, those are the main play styles that I tend to gravitate towards. But I do, there's a ton of like mixed play styles in all these, like all the ones I mentioned, and there's also more that like I probably didn't even think about. There are just so many different play styles, and yeah, I mean, this is the sort of last one. Some takeaways before I end the video. Just want to reiterate, there's no hard and fast rules when it comes to playstyles or strategies. Strategies always developing, playstyles are always developing, and the main way you can start to think about playstyles is by focusing on the game mechanics. What strategies can you use from that game mechanics? Which are good strategies? Which are strategies that are not as effective or that need specific tools in order to make effective? The risk aversion, the game knowledge, the proactiveness, all of this factors in when it comes to determining someone's playstyle. And I think the final takeaway, not on the slide, is, hopefully this video has given you something to think about when it comes to your own playstyle. Whether you think you fit into any of the categories or not. Sort of like thinking about what sort of team you can build for yourself, or have built for yourself that really plays to your preferences and what feels natural to you. How you succeed in those arenas. And yeah, thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and let's continue the discussion on Discord. Peace out.